Imagine a city divided not by a river or a mountain but by a wall. That was Berlin during the Cold War. A time when the world was caught in the grip of tension between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their ideological differences, democracy versus communism, would cast a long and chilling shadow over the second half of the 20th century. So, let's delve into the heart of the Cold War, Berlin. After World War II, Germany was divided amongst the victors, the eastern part falling under Soviet influence, the western under the Allies. Berlin, the capital, was also split, even though it sat entirely within East Germany. Thus, the stage was set for a city within a city, an island of the west surrounded by a sea of the east. In the early 1960s, the East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, built a wall around West Berlin. Ostensibly, it was to protect its citizens from the decadent influences of the West, but in reality, it was to stop the mass exodus of people seeking a better life on the other side. Over the years, the Berlin Wall grew taller, more fortified, becoming the most potent symbol of the Cold War division. The wall not only divided a city, it divided families, friends, and loved ones. It stood as a stark reminder of an ideological battle, a world split in two. It was more than just a physical barrier. It was a flashpoint of escalating tensions between the East and West. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill famously spoke about. It represented the fear and distrust that had seeped into the heart of the world, a silent, haunting testament to the human cost of ideological conflict. As we navigate the history of the Cold War, we'll come to understand that the Berlin Wall, this seemingly impenetrable barrier, was not just a wall. It was a symbol of a world in conflict, a world in fear, a world in division. The Berlin Wall stood not just as a physical barrier, but a stark symbol of a world divided. The winds of change were blowing across Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. The Iron Curtain, the symbolic barrier separating the East from the West, was beginning to show signs of wear. In East Germany, a country ruled by a communist regime and marked by the intimidating Berlin Wall, discontent was growing. The East German government, led by the Socialist Unity Party, had ruled with an iron fist since the end of the Second World War. Life in East Germany was marked by censorship, surveillance, and a lack of personal freedoms. For many, the Berlin Wall was not just a physical barrier but a symbol of their isolation and the oppressive regime under which they lived. But change was in the air. The winds of freedom that had started to blow in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were also felt in East Germany. These policies encouraged transparency and restructuring, which led to greater freedom of speech and a loosening of political control. The people of East Germany were not blind to these changes. They saw the reforms taking place in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries, and they wanted the same. The seeds of discontent began to sprout, and a wave of protests and reform movements swept across the country. One of the key figures in this wave of change was New Forum, a political movement that called for democratic reforms in East Germany. Despite the government's attempts to suppress it, New Forum gained a massive following. The movement's peaceful protests and calls for change resonated with the people, and its influence continued to grow. In the summer of 1989, the pressure on the East German government reached a boiling point. Hungary, a fellow Eastern Bloc country, decided to open its borders with Austria, providing an escape route for East Germans to the west. This was a major blow to the East German government, which had always relied on the physical barrier of the Berlin Wall to keep its citizens in check. The mass exodus of East Germans through Hungary further fueled the protests at home. The government's attempts to stem the tide only served to ignite the flame of revolution. By the autumn of 1989, hundreds of thousands of East Germans were taking to the streets in peaceful protests calling for freedom and the end of the Berlin Wall. Key figures in the government began to realize that change was inevitable. Egon Krenz, who would soon become the leader of East Germany, advocated for reforms. But it was too late. The people had spoken, and they would not be silenced. As the pressure mounted, the wall that had stood for decades was on the brink of collapse. The stage was set for one of the most significant events of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall. On November 9, 1989, a seemingly ordinary day turned extraordinary. Suddenly the winds of change began to blow through the city of Berlin. It started with an announcement, a statement that would echo across the world and into the annals of history. The East German government, under pressure from a restless and discontented population, made a momentous decision. They announced that all citizens of the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, were free to cross the borders. They could go west. The announcement, intended to be a controlled relaxation of the travel restrictions, was not planned to take immediate effect. But the news spread like wildfire, fueled by the restlessness of a people yearning for freedom. Thousands of East Berliners, hearing rumors of the wall's opening, gathered at the border crossings, demanding to be let through. The border guards, unprepared and confused, found themselves in an impossible situation. The crowd was growing, the atmosphere tense, and then, in a moment that would be etched in history, they stepped aside. They opened the gates. What followed was a spontaneous eruption of joy and disbelief. East Berliners poured through the gates, greeted by the jubilant crowds from West Berlin. Tears were shed, hugs were shared, and champagne bottles popped. People began to climb the wall, chipping away at the concrete symbol of division with hammers and chisels, a phenomenon that would later be known as Mauerpekt, or wall pecking. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the end of a physical barrier, it was the crumbling of an ideological divide that had split a city, a country, and the world. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, a sign that change was not only possible, but inevitable. In the blink of an eye, the wall that had divided a city and symbolized a divided world was no more. With the fall of the wall, the world watched as history unfolded. A monumental moment, a literal and symbolic crumbling of a barrier that had kept a nation and indeed the world divided. The aftermath was both immediate and far-reaching. In the heart of Europe, a country divided was on the path to becoming one again. The reunification of Germany, a process filled with joy, apprehension, and a great deal of paperwork, was a beacon of hope. Families torn apart by the wall were reunited. The East and the West, once kept apart by concrete and barbed wire, now began the process of healing and rebuilding. Yet the impact of the fall of the Berlin Wall extended far beyond Germany's borders. It signaled the end of the Cold War, a period of tension and competition that had held the world in its icy grip for over 4 decades. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism, between democracy and dictatorship, had reached a critical turning point. And then there was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the superpower that had been at the heart of the Cold War. The once mighty empire which had stretched from Eastern Europe to Northern Asia began to fragment. Independent nations emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union, each with their own aspirations and challenges. This was a time of great change and uncertainty, but also a time of opportunity and hope. In the wake of the Berlin Wall's fall, the world had to navigate uncharted waters. New alliances were formed, old grudges were put to rest, and the geopolitical landscape was forever altered. Yet amidst all this change, there was a sense of optimism. The fall of the wall was not just the end of an era of division and conflict, it was the dawn of a new era. An era marked by cooperation, by dialogue, and by a shared commitment to peace and prosperity. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked not just the end of an era but the beginning of a new one. An era that continues to shape our world today. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a pivotal moment in history that reshaped the world. This concrete barrier, once a symbol of division, became a testament to the power of people and their longing for freedom. We journeyed through the Cold War era, exploring the birth of the Berlin Wall, a stark emblem of a world divided. We navigated the tumultuous events leading to its fall, a series of circumstances that culminated in a collective cry for unity echoing beyond borders. The fall itself, a momentous event, was more than just the crumbling of concrete. It was the collapse of an ideology that had held the world captive for decades. The aftermath ushered in a new era, a time of change and transformation. The fall of the wall sparked the end of the Cold War and the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. As we look back, we see not just a wall that fell but a world that came together.